if you're anything like the average podcaster, you've no doubt spent horrible hours and hours editing your show, trying to make it consistent, trying to get something out every single week, but generally failing and struggling to keep it consistent. Well, the guy I'm talking to today could be the answer to your dreams, because he has done 400 episodes on the trot every single week consistently. And he's sharing everything that he's learned over that time to be consistent relentlessly, to build a team to help you over time. Although in the early days, it was just him. So there's loads to learn from that as well. And from back then, he's got practical systems, mindsets, frameworks that helped him to keep that show coming out every single week for 400 plus episodes. Not only that, but build a whole business behind a 6-figure business that now runs because of that podcast. So who is this miracle worker? Well, it's Matty Lansdowne from the Don't Get Sick and Die podcast. Very practically named. And this session is all like that as well. It's all practical. It's all actionable, all about giving you a whole bunch of stuff that you can go away and use. So let's jump into it. I started by asking Matty how he started to develop that mindset that helped him get to 400.
It's a good question, because I think podcasting is, as you know, there's so much that's involved on the back end. And I think compared to maybe Instagram or TikTok or the other platforms that you might choose for organic growth in a business, I feel like, and maybe it's changed, but I feel like podcasting is a bit of a bigger commitment. And whenever somebody asks me, can you, give me a rundown on how to start a podcast? I always ask, are you sure? Because it's, that's why the statistics are the way they are in regards to how many people give up. There's a lot involved. And so I think one of the things that I, in regards to my mindset, that I guess maybe growing up in sport was really helpful, was just this idea of commitment to sort of a goal, which I guess is not about vanity metrics. I think that was the important thing, right? And so in the very beginning when I started, I got some great advice from a mentor, because I burnt myself out trying to be everywhere all of the time on all of the platforms. And then he just said, "What are you good at?" And I basically said, "Speaking and having opinions." And he said, "Amazing, be on a podcast." And so I just decided I'm going to get rid of all of the other noise, and if I happen to have the energy to post anywhere else, I would do that. But that I had to religiously every Wednesday commit to 100 episodes of a podcast, no matter what the metrics said, no matter if nobody was listening. And so I just committed. I was like, 100 is a round number. That's 2 years of weekly podcasts. I'll reassess then. So I think I find that really powerful, because after that 100, it's now a part of my identity. I'm the guy that's never missed a podcast. And so because it's such a fundamental part of my identity now, it just is, And so I can't ever miss a podcast. That would be so off brand, right? It would attack my integral belief in who I am.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah. So it's like how it's committing to a certain length of time where it becomes really a part of what you do, just an integral part of what you do. How long do you think that takes? Do you think 100's a minimum? I mean, that's a couple of years. Like, do you think, did that kick in earlier, do you think?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. But at the same time, it depends what you're building, because I think, if you're leaning towards podcasts, there's long form content, and the people that listen to long form content, the numbers are lower compared to a viral TikTok, but they're usually more invested. And so for me, the other thing that I like about long form content, which is not saying that short form content doesn't have its relevance and its place, and I also use it. But the thing is, I don't want a business that's going to be amazing for 1 year and then dies, right? I would rather build steadily and slowly over a long period of time, so that, in 10 years, life is much better than it is now, rather than just stuck in the grind of having tried 10 ideas in 10 years. So once I found my thing, I thought, sure, maybe I could get enough data in 30 episodes or 50 episodes, but I was sort of thinking, either way, the business behind the podcast and my desire to impact the world and in the area of health and wellness and nutrition, that's there anyway. So even if I do 100 episodes and it fails, there's still 100 episodes of content that's relevant to my mission and my vision out there in the world for people to find.
Yeah. I love that concept of here's my here's my core goal. So I need to get an episode out on a Wednesday every single week. And then you're because we can't help it. We're creators. We're always thinking about these other things to do with the content, isn't it? So you're like,
Yeah.
but that cannot stop me. Bonus points to get like clips out or get like a newsletter out or all these other things out is bonus points if I have the extra time. But I
Yeah.
cannot let that stop me getting just the episode out and taking a win from actually releasing that episode on its own as well, even if you don't get any of the other things done.
Yeah, I think that's so important because especially if it becomes a part of your normal workflow, it starts no longer feeling like a win. It's just the default things that you achieve. And so I think, yeah, making sure that you know in your business what is the thing that holds the business together. And for me, at this stage, the podcast is very much the fundamental foundation level where 99% of clients find me. They spend, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 episodes before they reach out and choose to spend money with the business. So it's like, even though there's all these other shiny objects, I'd like, oh, maybe I'll start a newsletter. Oh, I'll do this. It's like, hang on. What's paying the bills? What's feeding the kids? That kind of scenario.
Bring it back.
Back to the podcast.
Nice. I'd love to dig into that as well. Actually, later on, I'll ask you a few questions around the business behind this as well, and what the podcast powers. That'd be really interesting to get into, actually. But just now, like, it was Matthew that introduced me to you, and his kind of one of his main things that he said you were great at was the workflows, the systems. And it sounds like, I mean, what do you have to put in place to make sure that happens? That you do. That is the thing that everyone commits to. Like, I'm going to do a weekly podcast, but most people fall off the wagon. But you actually managed to make it happen. So what do you have to put in place to actually make sure you get that out every single week?
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky at this point. I don't do much more than hit record, and then it's taken over by my two fantastic team members who have been around since episode 80. So it's a well-oiled machine, 350 episodes later or whatever we're at now. And so I guess two parts to that system. One is having systems thinking, and often people that are creative are usually a little bit at conflict with that idea of systems thinking because it's repetitious, it's boring, it's unexciting, it's methodical. But the way that I see it, and I think I said this to you before we hit record, was that the idea of writing down a process or a SOP, a standard operating procedure, to hand off the task to somebody else really excites me because it's the last time I'll have to do the unexciting bit of the podcast.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think, having systems thinking is important, but even if you don't, like sort of pushing yourself out of your comfort zone to get it down on paper, maybe the screenshots as well, maybe screen shares or screen grabs of you doing the task as well, putting it all into a document that is easy to understand, easy to follow. So the SOPs is part 2, systems thinking 1, SOPs part 2. But the third part is essential, and that's team members that also have systems thinking. And I think that's really important when it comes to team members and employees that are in those types of admin roles or sort of day-to-day repetitive task roles, is that like we've got our creative guy, the multimedia guy that does all the editing. He is definitely not the person that does all the organizing and the planning and the scheduling, right? Because they're both very different personalities. So I think, the team behind it is very, very good. And sort of Janet, who does my admin and management of myself and our designer, she is incredibly systems thinking, follows the SOPs to a T, finds things that everybody else misses. She's fantastic. So I think there's those three elements are important to developing those systems, because the brilliant thing is most of us don't like all of those tasks. We do it to have these conversations, right? To hang out with cool people, have D&Ms, discover things, and then we sort of shut the camera down and we're like, oh, it's just me in my room now. That's very boring. And so if we can hand those tasks off to somebody else who absolutely thrives in that environment, it allows us more time to get on more of these interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Yeah, building a team, it's such a tricky thing. I love that framework though, actually being able to figure out who kind of mirrors your thinking around following those SOPs, those systems. I've had exactly the same thing where we've hired people where yeah, they either can or they can't. You're like, well, here's some instructions, but a lot of people just struggle with that. And maybe it is something around, they're
Yeah.
just very good at something else, and it's just not necessarily following a rote set of instructions. And yeah, it's interesting. Matty, one thing, I'm going to just do an wee edit point here. My radiator's going crazy. I'm just going to turn it off.
Yeah, that's okay.
Very occasionally it makes this really high pitched noise. There we go. Edit to point. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So assuming though that somebody is early enough that they didn't have, they maybe can't get a team in the first place. You said about episode 80, you hired somebody. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I was 2 a.m. and the podcast was due to come out at 5 a.m., 3 hours later. And I still had my day job I worked in a cancer hospital. And I just had this moment of, I'm only ever going to edit a free podcast in my spare time if I don't get help.
Yeah. So, but what did you do? Were there any particular tricks or mindsets or frameworks you used before that for those first 80 to actually stick to it? Because that's still a year and a half of getting a podcast out every single week, which is impressive.
Yeah. No, I think it was just mainly, I didn't want to be someone that said I was going to do something and didn't do it. That was honestly the big thing. And maybe it's myself or maybe it's a lot of podcasters, because usually we're kind of extroverted people. So I basically told everyone I'm going to do 100 episodes of a podcast. And that meant that I just felt socially accountable to the words that I had spoken, so that I had to do it. And then it became a conversation point when I caught up with people. It's like, oh, so is this podcast happening? I'm like, yeah, episode 22. And then see them a few weeks later and I'm like, yeah, all right. Yeah, we're at 40 now. And they're like, oh, you're really doing this. Okay. Then there's like, yeah, I'm the podcast guy now,
That's brilliant. I think one thing that we often tell people as well, or advise, is to have that certain day of the week as well. It sounds like Wednesdays was your day. I'm not sure if you recorded that day too, but was that kind of part of it as well? Just having that really solid routine?
Yes. However, I would say one thing that was important to me, because I had a day job and a relationship and life, like all of us have, I strived to always be 8 weeks ahead of schedule. And so that's generally the agreement that I have with my team as well. And we sort of fluctuate between, 3 or 4 ahead of schedule and 10 ahead of schedule. We bounce in that space. But for me, just to have no anxiety about it going out and it being okay, and if somebody cancels or there's a tech issue with one episode, we're totally fine. So for me, I used to sit down, and this is probably still the same now, and maybe some hardcore entrepreneur types would disagree with this mentality, but for me, I have to be in flow. And so sometimes I'm just in flow and ideas are pouring out of my head and I'm in podcast mode and I'm not saying and ah all of the time. And I just will smash out 3 or 4 or 5 podcasts in an afternoon. But then, some weeks it is much tougher to actually get the creative juices flowing. And I have to listen to other podcasts in my industry to get inspiration, and be like, oh, what are people talking about? Like, I don't even know, I'm brain dead, today or this week, and I have to produce content. So, and I think all creators go through the high and the low of content creation and having lots of ideas and then having seemingly nothing. So I like to be in flow and sit down and wait for that flow to happen. But if it doesn't happen, I have to curate it.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's like we talked in the last week's episode actually a little around the kind of pro versus the amateur mindset and the feeling that, you have to do it. Like professional writers, journalists don't get writer's block because they just have to deliver a story, and potentially they are waiting for a certain part of the week, or they're able to kind of power that flow. They're able to trigger that in more ways than one. But I love your approach to it as well, in which you're saying, when it does happen, you just make the most of it. So when you've got a day where you are like that, you get 5 weeks worth of content out of it when you're in that kind of mood. That's excellent. Are you doing so is your show a solo show?
No. So what happened is about 3 years into the podcast, I was sort of the numbers were starting to stagnate a little bit, and they were sort of getting stuck around 25, 30,000 a month. And so what I thought I could do to double the download numbers would be to add another episode in. So I sort of changed slightly the format. So previously I would do a week on, week off solo interview. And then once I added a second episode per week, it was basically a coaching with Matty episode that happened on Monday. So Monday's episode for the last 2 years and ongoing is like a short 10, 15-minute episode, very direct, very sort of behavior-oriented, psychology-oriented. And then Wednesdays is the interview. Now, occasionally I'll still do a Wednesday episode solo if there's a spot or something I really think needs to be said. But that's kind of how it's fallen now, is that I do the short, sharp episodes on Monday and the interviews are Wednesday.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so you're mixing it up. I really love that approach, because the solo episodes are so much building your authority, like your connection with the audience, much more than the interview ones, but you're still getting the interview ones in for the variety and bringing in external factors and stuff. And some of the shows we work with will have people, doing 3 interview shows in a month. And then the fourth one of the month, like, the end of the month, it's a solo show where the person showcases a bit more of their expertise and experience and all of that kind of stuff. So mixing it up, that's great. And it was just when you said, you can knock out 5 in a row. That's the big advantage of doing a solo show, isn't it? That you don't have to rely on somebody else's calendar. Never mind the quality of their content as well. Have you found it hard to transition to just being able to speak by yourself for 10 to 15 minutes?
No, I think before I actually started the podcast, and the reason that I guess my mentor at the time sort of had suggested is podcasting a thing that you can do, is because I'd done a lot of public speaking before that. So it wasn't too much of a transition. And another added factor that made the transition easier was that I've been a musician for 17, 20 years now. And so sitting down in front of microphones and tech and recording and editing software wasn't unfamiliar to me. So those two factors set me up very nicely to be a podcaster. But which is why when I speak to anyone, my advice is, what are your strengths? Go towards the platform. Is it podcasting? Is it Instagram? Is it blog writing? Go towards the place that caters towards your strengths, because otherwise it can be a really difficult process to force yourself through it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.